It happened without warning, without ceremony. And when Prince William found out, the calm of the palace shattered in seconds. The call that broke the calm. The call came just after dawn, at that hour when the palace still pretends to be asleep. Prince William had already been awake. He often was. Winter had a way of sharpening his instincts, pulling him into the day before the household caught up. The briefing folders lay unopened on the desk. The fire was lit but untouched. There was no sense yet that anything was wrong. Then his phone rang. It was not a courtier. It was not an aide. It was someone who never called unless something had already gone wrong. The message was simple, clinical, almost apologetic. Camilla had spoken direct to Catherine, not through channels, not through offices, not as protocol demanded. She had instructed her to lend a tiara. For a moment William said nothing. There are rules inside the monarchy that are never written down because they do not need to be. One of them is this: certain things are never demanded. They are offered or they are left alone. The tiara in question did not belong to Camilla. It did not belong to the crown in the abstract. It was bound to Catherine's role, her future, and her private dignity. And Camilla knew that. What made the request worse, what turned it from improper to incendiary, was the timing. Catherine was still navigating a fragile period. Her health had been the subject of quiet accommodation, carefully shielded from public scrutiny. Every appearance was weighed. Every demand was measured except this one. Camilla had not asked whether Catherine was well enough. She had not consulted William. She had bypassed the future king entirely. Instead, she had framed it as a necessity, a formal appearance, a symbolic moment, a reminder of hierarchy. By the time William absorbed the full shape of what had happened, his composure had hardened into something colder. This was not about jewelry. It was about power, about who could still command obedience behind closed doors, about whether Catherine's position was protected or merely tolerated, and about whether William's authority could be quietly tested without consequence. He stood, the chair scraping sharply against the floor. For years he had swallowed compromises for the sake of stability. He had allowed tensions to remain unspoken. He had trusted that boundaries once learned would be respected. This crossed all of them, and as the palace began to stir around him, one truth settled heavily into place. Camilla had made her move, and William was no longer willing to let it pass. The tiara that wasn't offered. Inside the monarchy, objects remember things people pretend to forget. The tiara had never been loud. It was not one of the heavy diamond-dense relics that announced conquest or empire. It did not arrive on velvet cushions during televised unveilings. Nor did it demand reverence through sheer weight. Its power lay elsewhere in restraint, in lineage, in the quiet continuity it represented. It had been worn sparingly, deliberately, almost protectively. When Catherine first received it, there had been no ceremony, no photographs released, no breathless press briefings. That it had been framed as stewardship, not possession. A piece entrusted to her role, meant to signal what lay ahead without forcing it into the present. That distinction mattered. Within the royal household there is a sacred grammar to these things. Who offers, who receives, who waits, who never asks. This tiara existed within that grammar. It was associated with transition, moments when a woman stepped closer to the future without being pushed into it. When dignity was preserved through patience, when symbolism did its work quietly. That was why it had never been loaned. Not to visiting dignitaries, not to secondary engagements, not even during moments of institutional strain when optics were tempting shortcuts. To request it was not in itself forbidden, but to demand it without consultation, without reciprocity, without acknowledgement of circumstance was something else entirely. Because this tiara was not neutral, it had become over time an extension of Catherine's position at the heart of the monarchy's next chapter. She wore it rarely, but when she did, it signaled calm continuity, stability without spectacle, the promise of longevity in an institution that survived by thinking in decades, not headlines. Camilla understood this better than most. She had learned the monarchy's emotional craft the hard way. She knew what it meant to be peripheral, to wait, to endure the slow grind of public resistance and private compromise. She also knew how power shifted quietly, incrementally when one person was elevated and another was left to hover in uncertainty, and that was why the request landed with such force. It was framed later as logistical, as a matter of appropriateness, as a question of availability, but none of that held. The engagement Camilla cited was important. Yes. Formal, carefully staged, the Kindhoff appearance meant to reassure donors, foreign guests, and a restless domestic audience that the monarchy remained aligned and unified. Yet there were alternatives, other pieces, other symbols, other solutions that did not involve Catherine at all. Instead, the tiara was named specifically, which meant the message was specific too. This was not about sparkle. It was about precedence. The boundary crossed was invisible to the public but unmistakable inside palace walls. It lies between what is offered freely and what is extracted through rank, between cooperation and coercion, between respect and assumption. Catherine's health made the breach sharper. In recent months, her schedule had been softened, appearances spaced, expectations managed with unusual care. Those closest to her spoke in careful euphemisms, never naming the fragility outright, but acknowledging it through accommodation. Camilla had been briefed on all of this. She knew Catherine was conserving strength, that each decision carried weight beyond protocol, that even symbolic requests carried emotional cost, which is why the tone of the outreach mattered as much as the content. It had not been tentative. It had not been phrased as optional. It had carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to compliance. That authority was not hers to wield within the monarchy. Queens consort do not issue instructions to future queens. They advise, they defer. They allow the institution's natural hierarchy, present authority, giving way to future stability, to do its work without friction. By bypassing William, Camilla had disrupted that balance. By pressing Catherine directly, she had introduced a private pressure no one could see and none could openly challenge except William. The tiara in this moment became something else, a test. Would Catherine yield quietly, preserving surface harmony at personal cost? Would the future king tolerate a maneuver that reasserted old hierarchies under the guise of necessity? Would the institution reveal which woman it protected when circumstances grew uncomfortable? These questions did not need to be spoken. They hung in the air of private rooms, in the pauses between calls, in the careful neutrality of aides, who sensed something had shifted, but did not yet know how far. For Catherine, the object itself was almost irrelevant. She had never sought the symbolism others projected onto her. She had worn what was given when it was given without complaint or spectacle. Her authority had always come from composure, not ornament, but she understood what this moment represented. To lend the tiara would be to acknowledge a hierarchy that no longer reflected reality. To concede silently that her position was conditional, that her well-being was secondary to appearances decided elsewhere, and to refuse would be to invite scrutiny, speculation, quiet resentment dressed up as disappointment. This was the monarchy's most dangerous terrain, the space where nothing is said aloud, but everything is remembered. By the time William fully grasped the weight of the request, the damage was already done. Not because a tiara had been named, but because something sacred had been treated as convenient. And once that line is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed, only confronted. The tiara had not been offered. It had been taken for granted. And that, more than anything else, was what ignited the fury that followed. Camilla's quiet campaign. Camilla did not act suddenly. She never had. What appeared on the surface to be a single overstep was in fact the culmination of weeks, perhaps months of quiet positioning, a series of small, deniable movements that only revealed their pattern once the final piece was placed. Those closest to her would later insist there had been no malice, that she was merely doing what queens consort have always done, smoothing appearances, preserving continuity, ensuring the institution did not look fragile at a moment when fragility was the last thing it could afford. But that explanation, neat as it sounded, did not survive scrutiny, because this had never been about urgency. It had been about control. In the months leading up to the tiara request, Camilla's presence within palace operations had subtly expanded. She attended meetings she once skipped, asked questions she once left unanswered, took a sudden interest in ceremonial details that had previously been delegated without comment. It was not aggressive. It was administrative, and that was precisely why it worked. Camilla understood the language of survival inside the monarchy. She had lived long enough on its margins to know that overt grabs for authority were punished, while quiet consolidation was often rewarded, or at least tolerated. So she framed everything as stewardship, concerns about optics, questions about symbolism, gentle reminders of tradition. Each intervention taken alone seemed harmless, sensible even. But taken together, they formed a narrative, one in which Catherine's reduced visibility created a vacuum that needed to be filled, managed, guided. Camilla never said Catherine was weak. She never questioned her capability. She never raised her voice or issued a direct critique. Instead, she spoke of continuity, of reassurance, of the need for visible unity during uncertain months, of how the public reads absence. These phrases circulated quietly among senior aides, gaining traction not because they were malicious, but because they were difficult to refute. No one wanted to be the one to say optics did not matter. No one wanted to suggest that appearances could wait. Least of all, when the king's health had become a subject of careful management, and the monarchy's public image felt more fragile than it had in years. Camilla knew this. She also knew where the real decision-makers were and where they were not. William, increasingly assertive, but still navigating the delicate balance between heir and subordinate, was often careful to avoid unnecessary confrontation. He chose his battles. Had trusted that respect, once established, would be reciprocated. Camilla exploited that trust not by challenging him, but by going around him. Her outreach to Catherine was not impulsive. It was timed. It came after several internal conversations in which Camilla framed the upcoming engagement as particularly significant. A moment requiring gratis, a visual cue strong enough to reassure donors, partners, and skeptical commentators that the monarchy remained anchored. When alternatives were mentioned, she did not reject them outright. She simply allowed the conversation to drift back again and again to the same object, the tiara, presented not as Catherine's, but as available, not as symbolic, but as appropriate, not as sensitive, but as underutilized. Language matters in these rooms. By the time Camilla reached out directly, the groundwork had been laid. The request sounded reasonable because it had been rehearsed in quieter forms elsewhere. What she did not anticipate was the effect of bypassing William entirely. In her mind, this was efficient, clean, a private conversation between two women bound by shared duty, a moment of quiet understanding that avoided unnecessary escalation. But Camilla misjudged Catherine, and she misjudged William even more. Catherine did not respond immediately. She listened. She thanked Camilla for thinking of her. She asked for time. That pause, measured, polite, unmistakable, was the first sign that the maneuver had failed because Catherine understood what was happening. She recognized the pressure beneath the politeness. The expectation dressed up as collegiality, the subtle repositioning of authority that suggested her role could be adjusted when circumstances made her inconvenient. This was not guidance. It was encroachment. Camilla, for her part, interpreted the pause differently. She took it as hesitation that could be overcome, as uncertainty that could be nudged, as evidence that Catherine, ever careful, might ultimately comply rather than disrupt harmony. So the pressure continued, not through repeated calls, not through overt insistence, through silence. Silence can be a powerful tool in the palace. It creates unease. It invites self-doubt. It leaves the recipient to wonder whether refusal will be remembered, whether accommodation will be expected next time. Camilla let that silence stretch. She allowed aides to mention the engagement in passing. Let others reference preparations as though the matter were settled. She did not correct them. This was the quiet campaign at its most effective, letting inevitability do the work. But there was a flaw in the strategy. William was not as insulated as Camilla assumed. Word reached him not through formal channels, but through the cracks, an offhand remark, a careful check-in that carried more weight than it appeared to, enough for him to sense that something was unfolding without his consent. When he pressed for clarity, the answers were vague, framed as coordination, as routine, as nothing requiring his direct involvement. That more than anything confirmed his suspicion. Camilla had not sought approval because she did not want it. She wanted compliance without confrontation. The motive, when viewed coldly, was not personal rivalry. It was institutional positioning. Camilla was asserting relevance at a moment when the future was visibly encroaching on the present. She was reminding the system and perhaps herself that she still mattered, still influenced outcomes, still shaped appearances. But in doing so, she misread the limits of her authority. The monarchy tolerates many things. It tolerates ambition. It tolerates maneuvering. It even tolerates resentment so long as it remains contained. What it does not tolerate, what it cannot survive, is confusion about succession. By treating Catherine as a resource rather than a protected figure, Camilla blurred a line that had been carefully maintained. She suggested, however unintentionally, that the future queen's role was negotiable. William saw that immediately, and once he did, the issue ceased to be about a tiara or even about Camilla. It became about whether the future of the monarchy could be quietly managed by those whose time was by definition limited. Camilla's campaign had been quiet, but its implications were thunderous. And the moment William decided to confront it, the silence that had sustained it began to collapse. Kate's impossible position. Catherine had learned over years of public life how to disappear without leaving. It was a skill rarely acknowledged and never praised, but it had become essential. She could soften her presence, quiet her instincts, and make space for others without seeming diminished. The monarchy rewarded this kind of discipline. It mistook restraint for resilience and silence for strength. But there are moments when silence becomes a burden rather than a shield. This was one of them. When Camilla's request arrived, Catherine did not react outwardly. There was no visible shock, no flicker of offense. She listened carefully as she always did, absorbing not only the words spoken, but the intent beneath them. Years of proximity power had sharpened her sensitivity to tone. She knew when something was being offered and when something was being assumed. This was the latter. What unsettled her most was not the tiara itself, nor even the manner of the request. It was the underlying premise that her position, her circumstances, her well-being could be quietly subordinated to someone else's agenda. She had lived long enough within the institution to recognize the danger of such moments. They rarely announced themselves as crises. They arrived instead as inconveniences framed as reasonable, solvable, and temporary. And they left behind permanent adjustments. Catherine's days, already measured with care, grew heavier. Her health had introduced a new rhythm into her life, one defined by limits she did not openly discuss. The palace had adjusted accordingly, smoothing explanations, protecting her privacy with practiced discretion. To the outside world, her absence appeared controlled, even strategic. Inside, it was something else entirely. Every decision required calculation. How much energy to expend? Which appearances mattered enough to justify the cost? Which expectations could be deferred without consequence?